first moments of realization and emotional tensio. There comes a moment in life when you realize people are not always interacting with you as a person. Sometimes they are interacting with what they believe they can get from you. And the strange part is, it never arrives dramatically. There is no warning, no obvious betrayal, no single event that changes everything. It happens quietly, through repeated moments. Where is your time, your energy, your understanding slowly become treated as something flexible instead of valuable. You remember the people who only appeared when they needed help, the ones who disappeared the moment you needed support. At first, you excuse it. You tell yourself it is a coincidence because you believe in understanding people. You believe in giving others the benefit of the doubt, but eventually, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore because it keeps repeating. Different people, different environments, different situations, yet somehow the same imbalance. And that is when the uncomfortable realization begins to form. Not that people are inherently evil, but many people operate from instinctive self-interest, without ever thinking about the emotional cost they leave behind. When you are naturally cooperative, you become easy to approach, easy to convince, easy to depend on. At first, that sounds positive, until you notice something darker beneath it. Ease is often mistaken for availability, and kindness is often mistaken for permission. There is a strange shift that happens when you stop reacting emotionally and start observing behavior instead. You begin noticing how often your boundaries are tested in subtle ways, not aggressively, not openly, quietly. A small favor becomes a repeated expectation. A moment of patience becomes a permanent role. A single act of understanding becomes something others quietly rely on without ever questioning whether it is fair. And in that silence, something important begins forming inside your awareness. You start understanding that the world does not always reward softness with respect. Sometimes it rewards it with repetition, expectation, emotional exhaustion. And that is where a difficult question finally appears, not from anger, from clarity. If you do not define your limits, who will define them for you? And will those definitions ever protect your well-being? This is where emotional strength truly begins, not as aggression, not as cruel, but as awareness sharpened into protection. Because without that shift, you do not become respected, you become utilized. And the difference between those two states changes the emotional direction of your entire life. Why emotional exploitation becomes normal without awareness. The deeper issue is not that people consciously wake up intending to use others. Most of the time, it happens naturally, because social systems often reward those who give endlessly without asking for equal return. In families, in workplaces, in friendships, even in casual interactions, the person who understands more usually absorbs more responsibility. And over time, that imbalance starts feeling normal. Not because it is healthy, but because repetition creates familiarity. Many people grow up learning that being agreeable is the safest way to maintain relationships. They are taught directly or indirectly that saying yes creates harmony and saying no creates conflict. As children, that lesson may seem harmless, but in adulthood, it becomes dangerous, because adult relationships require boundaries to remain emotionally stable. Without boundaries, relationships stop operating on mutual understanding. They begin operating on silent expectations instead. And in real life, this pattern appears everywhere. The employee who always stays late because they do not want to disappoint anyone. The friend who always listens but rarely feels heard. The family member who becomes everyone's emotional caretaker, regardless of their own emotional state. None of these roles are officially assigned. They are built slowly, through repetition, and through lack of resistance. That is what makes the pattern difficult to recognize. There is never one dramatic moment that announces you are being taken for granted. Instead, it happens through small accumulations of imbalance, moments that feel insignificant individually but overwhelming collectively. Eventually, The person begins feeling emotionally drained, but they cannot fully explain why. And over time, they start believing exhaustion is simply part of being responsible, part of being caring. That belief becomes dangerous, because once exhaustion feels justified, you stop questioning the system creating it. The world rarely teaches people how to protect their emotional resources. Instead, it teaches them how to give those resources freely, without conditions, without limits, without structure. And in an environment like that, imbalance stops being the exception. It becomes the default. The illusion that being good is enough to be respected. One of the most common misunderstandings in human behavior is the belief that kindness automatically creates respect. People assume that if they remain patient, understanding, and supportive, others will naturally return the same treatment. And morally, that idea feels correct because it aligns with the values most people are taught growing up. But real social dynamics are not governed only by morality. They are also governed by boundaries. People often respond more strongly to what they are allowed to do than to what they are asked not to do. And when there is no resistance to overstepping, many individuals will continue overstepping, not always maliciously, sometimes simply because no consequence exists. This misunderstanding survives because kindness often creates positive short-term reactions. People appreciate comfort. They appreciate help. They appreciate emotional support. But appreciation does not automatically create respect for limits. Without boundaries, appreciation slowly transforms into expectation, and expectation quietly evolves into entitlement. This is where confusion begins. Many individuals feel they are doing everything correctly. They remain patient, forgiving, available, yet they still feel emotionally undervalued because they are measuring morality while others are responding to structure. And morality without structure creates imbalance. Eventually, imbalance creates emotional fatigue. Another reason this belief survives is because society glorifies selflessness. People are praised for endless sacrifice, but rarely taught the importance of self-protection. So individuals learn to feel proud of giving endlessly while silently suffering from the consequences. The truth is not that kindness is weakness. The truth is that kindness without boundaries becomes vulnerability, and vulnerability without awareness becomes a repeated cycle of emotional depletion, a cycle people mistake for personality when it is actually behavior. Why intelligent individuals still fall into repetitive emotional patterns. Human behavior is deeply shaped by emotional conditioning, especially in environments where approval was tied to being agreeable. Many individuals unconsciously associate saying no with rejection and saying yes with safety. Over time, that association becomes automatic, so automatic that it overrides logical thinking during real social interactions. There is also a psychological mechanism known as social reinforcement. When a behavior creates acceptance once, the brain remembers it as successful. If being helpful created approval in the past, the brain begins repeating helpfulness automatically, not because it is always healthy, but because it once felt emotionally safe, and eventually, that response becomes a default pattern. Fear also plays a major role, not fear of danger, fear of disconnection. Many people are more afraid of losing relationships than they are aware of losing themselves inside those relationships. That fear creates hesitation around boundaries, even necessary ones. Identity attachment strengthens the cycle even further. When someone sees themselves as the good person, they unconsciously resist behaviors that conflict with that identity. Saying no begins feeling emotionally uncomfortable, not because it is wrong, but because it clashes with the internal image they built of themselves. Social environments reinforce this behavior constantly. The more accommodating someone becomes, the more others rely on them, The more they give, the more they are expected to give. And eventually, breaking the cycle starts feeling emotionally uncomfortable, even when the cycle itself is unhealthy. This is why even highly intelligent individuals fall into these patterns, because intelligence alone does not erase emotional conditioning. Awareness alone is not enough. Behavior must change too. And behavioral change requires confronting discomfort that most people were never trained to navigate. How this pattern appears in everyday life. Imagine a workplace where one employee constantly handles responsibilities beyond their role. At first, people appreciate them, managers praise them, co-workers rely on them. Everything feels positive. But slowly, additional responsibilities begin appearing, not officially, quietly, without increased recognition, without increased compensation. Eventually, that employee becomes the default problem solver, expected to absorb pressure regardless of capacity. And when burnout finally arrives, it feels sudden, even though it was built gradually over months. Now consider friendships. One person becomes the emotional support figure for everyone else. They listen constantly, advise constantly, comfort constantly. Everyone depends on them emotionally. But when they experience their own struggles, the same support rarely returns. Their pain becomes minimized, overlooked, because the group unconsciously assigned them the role of the strong one, the one who supposedly does not need help. The same structure appears inside families. One individual becomes responsible for maintaining harmony. They avoid conflict, smooth over tension, sacrifice their own preferences to keep peace. And eventually, that sacrifice becomes expected. Even small disagreements become their responsibility to resolve. Their emotional needs slowly disappear beneath everyone else's comfort. Every example follows the same psychological structure. Goodwill creates trust. Repeated behavior creates expectation. And lack of boundaries creates dependency. Most people do not recognize the shift until they feel emotionally overwhelmed. By then, the pattern is already deeply established. The gradual cost of unchecked emotional overgiving. If these patterns continue long enough, the first thing that disappears is emotional energy. Not suddenly, gradually, people begin experiencing exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. It comes from constant emotional output without emotional recovery. Over time, motivation decreases. Relationships stop feeling fulfilling. Internal balance begins fading quietly. As months become years, the imbalance becomes normalized. The person starts believing exhaustion is simply who they are, part of their personality, part of their responsibility. And once discomfort becomes identity, change feels unnecessary. In professional environments, this often creates stagnation. People who consistently overgive become overworked, but not necessarily respected. Their contribution becomes expected instead of valued, and eventually, frustration begins building internally. In personal relationships, the imbalance creates silent resentment, not always openly expressed, but deeply felt. The person slowly withdraws emotionally, even while remaining physically present, and over time, that emotional withdrawal creates isolation, even in rooms full of people. The long-term cost is rarely dramatic collapse. It is gradual erosion of emotional energy, of self-respect, of personal boundaries, a slow fading of internal stability until the person no longer feels connected to themselves. Building awareness, boundaries, and emotional strength. A healthier approach begins with one realization: kindness does not require self-sacrifice to remain meaningful. You can care about people without abandoning yourself. The real shift happens when you understand that boundaries are not barriers. They are structures that make relationships sustainable. One important change is learning to pause before automatic agreement. Instead of saying yes immediately, create space, a moment of consideration, because inside that small pause, control begins returning. Another important shift is separating guilt from responsibility. Many people feel guilty when declining requests, even when those requests exceed reasonable limits. But guilt is not always proof of wrongdoing. Often, it is simply a learned emotional response. Understanding that reduces unnecessary emotional burden. It is also important to observe patterns instead of isolated moments. One imbalance may not mean much, but repeated imbalance reveals relationship structure, and recognizing those patterns early prevents emotional exhaustion later. Finally, self-respect grows when personal time and emotional energy are treated as valuable resources because they are valuable. And once you truly understand that, your decisions naturally become more selective, not less kind, more conscious. Kindness given intentionally instead of unconsciously depleted, returning to awareness with clarity and calm perspective. When you look back at the beginning of this realization, you understand something important. The goal was never to become cold, never to become disconnected, never to lose empathy. The real goal was awareness, because generosity without awareness easily becomes imbalance. What once felt like random emotional exhaustion now reveals itself as a pattern, quietly forming beneath everyday interactions. And once you begin seeing those patterns clearly, your relationship with the world changes. You stop confusing availability with respect. You stop mistaking emotional sacrifice for emotional value. And slowly, you begin interacting differently, not aggressively, not defensively, but consciously, grounded, intentional. Over time, that awareness creates a different kind of presence. You become less reactive, more selective, more protective of where your energy goes. Healthy relationships grow stronger because they are built on mutual respect instead of silent imbalance. Unhealthy relationships lose their hold because the unspoken advantage they relied on no longer exists. And in the end, the deepest transformation is internal. It is the moment you stop measuring your value by how much pain you can tolerate for others and start measuring it by how well you protect your own emotional stability. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything about how life feels from the inside. If this perspective brought clarity to patterns you have noticed in your own life, consider subscribing for more explorations into psychology, human behavior, and emotional awareness.